Thank you all for coming. It's so great to see you all here today. I'm Kai Haley. I lead the design relations team here at Google, and I'm one of the creators of this program. And as many of you know who have been coming and joining us for the last year and a half, we created this series in order to make a space for the design community to come together and talk about the role of designers in crafting the future, particularly a future that we all want to be a part of. And sci-fi is a particularly relevant topic for this. I know I've been interested in science fiction for a very long time, probably since I was like 9. And I think many of you as well are also interested in this topic. So I'm very excited to have Chris Nossel with us today to talk about the relationship of sci-fi to interface design. Chris is a senior lead designer at the IBM's Watson customer experience tools. He's written 3 books and is the keeper of the blog Sci-Fi Interfaces. His spidey sense sometimes randomly goes off and has led him to investigate and speak internationally on a number of topics, including generative randomness, ethnographic research, and designing for the future. So with that, I'm very excited to welcome Chris. Hand it off to
Yay!
you. Yay!
Thank you so much. So hello and good evening, everyone. I have a quick favor to ask. In the audience tonight are my 2 nieces and my brother who have never seen me speak before. They're right here. So applaud and laugh more than you normally would to make me seem like really cool, because I want them to think that I'm cooler than I actually am. So let me go ahead and get started. I'm caffeinated, and my tendency is to speak very fast anyway. So we're in double jeopardy zone. If I'm talking too fast, give me the slow down Chris sign, and I agree to do it. So I'm here to talk tonight about the connections between real-world design and science fiction. If you're the twittering sort, you can find my personal Twitter there at Chris Nossel, but the blog, I keep a separate Twitter feed for the blog at Sci-Fi Interfaces. But let's dive into it. Let me see if I can earn your interest rather than just announce it. So this connection between design and science fiction. Both of those are really big words. So let me get a little more specific when I talk about design. I have a background in interaction design, and so I am talking primarily about interface and interaction design when I say design. And of course, science fiction, the bulk of it is largely about technological influences on our shared reality. And so interface and interaction design fits that pretty well. There are all sorts of other sci-fi and all sorts of other design. I'm not talking about those in the project that I've been involved with for, holy cow, about 15 years now, only touches on other design fields very briefly. Similar to the fact that design is a really big field, science fiction is gigantic, right? There are all sorts of ways that you could investigate science fiction. When we're looking at the interfaces in science fiction, that helps us narrow it down a great deal. First thing is you have to see it in order to evaluate an interface. So while there's like enormous amounts of fantastic literature in the world, I didn't include it in any of my surveys. There's in the very beginning of the book, in chapter 1, I go through a bit of the interface described in the book, The Time Machine. And in that description, hope to make it obvious to the reader how difficult it would be to try and evaluate the sequence of events, or how easy it is to grab the lever, how far back it pulls. All those things are tough, so we have to cast out literature. Sorry. Second thing is that we need the depictions of interface to be the same throughout a given story. And that means that all hand-drawn science fiction, from everything from Star Wars, what's the holiday special? You remember that little interstitial bit in that bit? That was all hand-drawn sci-fi. We can't review that. But I did include in the survey science fiction, 3D animated science fiction, partially because it stays the same between depictions. So when I speak about science fiction, I really mean screen science fiction, stuff that shows up in movies and television. So that's the design and the sci-fi that we are concerned with. How do we go about sort of investigating those two domains together in order to understand what sci-fi says about interface design? Well, me and my co-author, Nathan Shedroff, sat down a long time ago. I think it's like 12 years ago, he brought the idea up. And we watched a ton of sci-fi. But instead of just sitting back and watching it, we actually had it on our laptops and our fingers on the screen capture keys. And so as we watched as many science fiction movies as we could, we screen capped all the interfaces that came up. And I built a giant online database of all of those interfaces with a sort of folksonomy that we had tagged onto it. I'll ask this a lot during the course of the talk, but can anyone name the movie? Not you, Michael. Okay, Michael. It's Metropolis from 1927. We'll talk a little bit about that film. But in creating this giant online database of interfaces, especially with each interface being tagged, we were able to go back in and take a look at the tag cloud and use that as a basis for investigating the entire survey. I think at the end of the formal generation of the online database, before we actually began writing the book, I think we had 10,000 images. And this is the tag cloud that had resulted. And my favorite bit from this is the biggest word is glow. So if you leave here with nothing else, understand that science fiction technology glows. But this tag cloud wound up being the basis for the sort of table of contents for the book that we wrote on the topic, called Make It So, Interaction Design Lessons from Science Fiction, and the related blog called sci-fi-interfaces.com. Now, I did a little research earlier today on the book, and it's no longer for sale. And there's some funky algorithm at Amazon that compares the number of requests that they get for the supply, and the used book is now going for $105. So I'm a big deal. I'm not a big deal, but I do have 5 of these books in my garage. So if you're looking for one, I can cut you a deal and make some money. So it was that investigation, right? So we tried to be as studious as we could to take a look at what interfaces in science fiction teach us. And the book is composed of 2 parts. The first part is an investigation of the components of interfaces, like the typography, like the color, like motion graphics. And the second part is more about the uses for interfaces in science fiction, such as with education, such as with medicine. There's even the last chapter is about sex-related interfaces in science fiction, and there's more than you think. And there are non-lascivious things to learn about them. But this talk today will be material from the first chapter, which is really about these lines of influence and how they are related. And I'm going to talk to you about some tiny connections between science fiction and design, and then some macro connections between sci-fi and design. Let's first go in and take a look at this inner ring of my diagram, which is really about individual inspiration. Right? Science fiction is not like a hurricane. It just doesn't sort of happen. Right? People make it, and those people can be influenced by the things that they see and hear in the world. And of course, if you're in design, you can very easily be influenced by science fiction and vice versa. I'm going to show you 2 video clips, and in fact, this talk is full of video clips, so be prepared. But I'm going to tell you a story about how somebody in science fiction was influenced by something that they saw in the real world. And the thing that they saw in the real world was this project called the Visible Human Project. Now, if you're not familiar with the Visible Human Project, it's a little gory. But what the project leaders did was they asked for volunteers from the prison population to see if anyone wanted to donate their body to this project after they had died. A few did. What they did is they froze these bodies in a block of blue ice and then shaved them every, I think it's a millimeter, and then simply scanned the edge of this block of ice. And what they got was actually a really beautiful 3D database of the human body. There we go. So this is a video going laterally through a human body. And it's a fascinating project. This has opened up lots of visualization possibilities within the medical space, right? Because not only can you go transversely, but you can go in almost any arbitrary direction through this human body through their online interface. It's really beautiful and really fascinating. Somebody at Fox Pictures thought so too. So here in X-Men 2, we're going to take a look at a scene where a guard is coming in to check on Magneto. Whoever was at Fox Pictures needed to say, oh, well, how do they scan him for metal? And you can see on the very right-hand side there that what that interface designer did was actually use the Visible Human project. So yeah, somebody at Fox News needed this interface, and they just looked out in the world and on the internet for an inspiration that they could use to fit into that particular scene. And they found it, and they went with that particular individual inspiration. Not only does it happen from sci-fi makers who are looking at the real world for their inspiration, but it happens the other way as well, as real-world designers are taking a look at the things that appear in science fiction. What I'm going to show you now is a clip from the X-Men movie in 2000. But let me give you a little prologue. In the year 2000, there was a fellow by the name of Douglas Caldwell who worked for the U.S. Army Topographical Center. And he was successfully petitioned by his adolescent son to go see X-Men. Now, Douglas had no interest in superheroes, but he liked spending time with his son. So he agreed to go and watch this movie. And while watching it, he saw a solution to a problem that was 2,000 years old and that was key to his job.
Magneto is here, Liberty Island. Now, presumably, his objective is to mutate the world leaders at the UN summit on Ellis Island.
He doesn't know his machine kills. And judging from what the professor saw, if Magneto gave Rogue enough power, he could wipe out everyone in New York City.
All right, we can insert here at the George Washington Bridge. Come around the bank, just off of Manhattan. We land on the far side of Liberty Island, here.
So sometimes I like to pause it at the bridge because that's the actual one impossible moment in this interface. But if it's not going to show me the interstitials where I pause, it's not going to be any good. So the reason that Doug was super inspired by this one scene in the movie is his job was to create and provide 3D maps for generals in the field of battle. So word would come that, oh, hey, we're going to have troops in such and such valley, and generals don't think well with 2D maps. So his team looks up the space, creates 3D maps, breaks it down, and ships it to wherever in the world those generals are going to be. That's a problem because it's only a single-use map. They're very fragile. If the battle moves, then he's got to scramble to create a new map. But what he saw on this clip was an infinite map that could represent any topology anywhere on our world or any other world. So he was super giddy after he saw X-Men. He was like, this is great. And he went home and he wrote an RFP saying, I want to build something like this, and included a copy of the DVD. And within 2 years, they had a working model called the Xenotran Mark IV. Horrible name, but it has no audio, so I can talk over it. And this is an example of that machine in operation. So whereas the pin board in the X-Men was strictly pins that sort of raised and lowered themselves, the Xenotran goes one better. And it actually covers the pin board with a elastic sheet that is then vacuumed down on top of the pins in order to create a surface for projection. So they not only get a satellite view of the space, but it's 3D and can move over time. In fact, in this little clip, you'll actually see a little bit later that not only do they show a tsunami propagating in the South Pacific, but they also have a clip of Mars. And they are able to show you a 3D topographic image of the craters on Mars. Beautiful technology and directly inspired by something that was seen in science fiction. Isn't that fascinating? So, individual inspiration happens all the time by people who are making science fiction interfaces and people in the real world who are watching science fiction. Those are interesting. They're fun anecdotes. But As an investigator into the space, I am much more interested in the macro patterns than the micro patterns. So I want to talk to you about these outer rings in my diagram because they're the more fun bits. We're going to talk about the first arc, where design influences science fiction in a very particular way. And to do that, what I want to do is I want to show you a couple of clips in time. We're going to go way back in science fiction history. And I want you to think about the technologies that were in the world at the time that these films were made. The reason is because design establishes a paradigm in the world, and science fiction makers extend that paradigm when they do their work. So here's a little plot of all the key technologies and even world events. I don't expect you to read it from back there, but it's really lovely. So the first film we're going to take a look at is actually the first piece of science fiction ever filmed. Happens to be by a fellow by the name of Georges Méliès. I'm probably murdering the French. But in his short film, Voyage to the Moon, we see a whole bunch of professors who are elected to get into a spaceship to travel to the moon. It was recently colorized, so we have this lovely version. But what's really fascinating about this clip to me is that there is nothing in it that we would identify as an interface. How do you get people to the moon? You put them in a big bullet. How do you fire them up to the moon? You put them in a big gun. You light that with a really big match, and boom, they're off to the moon. How do you get out of a spaceship? You push the door. Now, it's no surprise that this film doesn't really concern itself with the realities of technology. Georges Méliès was more of a vaudevillian who was committing vaudeville acts to film. But it's also a time when audiences didn't have a lot of technology in their lives. This was just after the invention of the telephone, and it wasn't widespread. I would say most homes, certainly in rural America, didn't have electricity yet. So the notion that the filmmaker needed to explain how people got in and sealed a spaceship didn't concern him, probably didn't concern his audience either. So as a historical oddity, this is really nice. The next time we see science fiction in the history of science fiction, we have to go forward quite a long ways from 1902 to 1927. And again, I would ask you just by the little screen cap at the beginning of this, if you could identify it. But without that, we're just going to dive into the clip. So in this clip, we're seeing Joe Fraterson, who lives in sort of the upper-class city of Metropolis. And he's checking his messages. To do that, he looks at a piece of ticker tape, and he has to tune his phone. Once he's got the right channel, he picks up the phone, and he flips the switch a bunch. That flickers the lights down in the lower city, which Grot sees and races up to the interface to have a chat. Then he hangs up. I love Grot. He's a fantastic overactor, but apropos for a silent movie era. So as you can see in this clip, it's a pretty big mashup of technologies. It combines notions of a ticker tape, of a radio, because he has to tune in the frequency, certainly of film, that's a projected film back that's giving him his video screen, and a straight-up telephone that he picks up off the handle and holds to his mouth, and even custom electronics where he tries to get the attention of Grot down in the lower city. This made a lot of sense at the time because he was trying to convey to the audience, okay, you know all these things, but what if we put them together? You could have a video conference. Seems insane to us now and quite quaint because it's a mashup of all these technologies. But now I want you to compare a scene from 12 years later. We're going to take a look at Buck Rogers from 1939. Buck Rogers was a serial that preceded longer movies, kind of like trailers today, and that they were trying to bring in people who wanted to see the serial in addition to whatever movie was being played afterwards. I'm going to describe the scene a bit before we get to it, but it's largely the same thing. There are characters who want to see something on a video phone and then talk to the people that are being pictured on screen. But remember how Joe Fraterson had to tune in a channel and flip a switch and pick up a phone? Pay attention to how these characters do the same thing.
Wilmer and Rogers must prevail on the Saturnians to lend them a spaceship to return to Earth.
That's no Saturnian craft, Doctor. It's one of Killer Kane's spaceships.
Impossible.
I know that type of ship too well to be mistaken. Have you tried to contact them on our wavelength?
As a matter of fact, I haven't.
Oh, we must do so at once.
So charmingly, they have to go into another room for the audio.
There's a spaceship at 274.6. Contact it at once on our wavelength.
Yes, sir. Air Marshal calling spaceship on 274.6. Guys.
So quite a difference there, right? In the Metropolis example, he had to pick up, dial, check ticker tape. And in the second one, all they had to do was turn a knob, right? Both for, oh, get the right channel, turn off the channel to that weird sort of wavy surface, and even to turn the whole thing off. So what do you think happened in between? Television. If I had a book to give you, it'd be worth $105 and you would have won it. Television happened in between. So Fritz Lang, when he wrote Metropolis, didn't have television to rely on and say, oh, it's like television, but spacey. Right? The makers of Buck Rogers did have television to rely on. And so they said, oh, it's just like your TV at home, but bigger. And for some reason, the audio will be in the next room. Now, lest you think that this is some artifact of a black and white era, we're still doing it. Jumping all the way to 2012. Oh, we see an initial screen cap here. Can anyone guess what film this is from that screen alone? Avengers. Score. This is a screen from the Avengers. In this clip, Nick Fury has just said, no, not Nick Fury, but he has commanded that we go invisible. And here we see the technology in place. How does the ship go invisible? It has lots of projectors on the outside that make it invisible. So you see all those little blue points that were sort of projecting the picture of the sky? That doesn't make sense, right? That'll only work for one person in one place who's looking up at the right angle. Everyone else is like, what's that cloud doing offset there? Must be the Avengers. Sorry, must be S.H.I.E.L.D. Right? The audience knows projectors, and the filmmakers have this thing that they want you to believe, that they can make the helicarrier invisible. So they comp together some fake technologies that you all buy into very quickly, and I do too, sorry, that make us go, okay, we accept that. We accept that there's a ship that can go invisible. So it's not really an artifact of the black and white era. It's just a fact of the world. Science fiction extends the paradigms that the real world design establishes. Pretty fascinating knowing that if you're a designer, like I am in the world, that you are influencing sci-fi in some pretty fundamental ways. So now we're going to go down and we're going to take a look at how science fiction in turns influences the real world. And I found 3 categories when I did the initial investigation. We're going to take a look at the first one, which is setting audience expectations. There are 2 main ways that science fiction sets our expectations as an audience. The first is what form technology will take. And to see this, we're going to go back to 1967 to Star Trek.
Party to Enterprise. No sign of Dr. McCoy. Search progressing.
There are 2 pieces of technology in there, but the one I want you to pay attention to is the communicator.
Captain, I've lost contact with the ship. I was talking to them. Suddenly it went dead. No static, just nothing.
Kirk to Enterprise. Scotty.
He hands it to IT.
Nothing wrong with the communicator, sir.
So the thing I want to point out to you is that Star Trek communicators open in a very certain way. They open up like this, in a clamshell mode. The reason I bring this up is because the Motorola. Motorola in 1989 had a cell phone that opened up like a Cameo, and it wasn't doing very well. So they went to a particular designer within the organization and said, "Why aren't our cell phones selling very well?" And he said, "Well, you've designed them wrong." He said, "For 30 years, we've been trained that communicators open like this." So they invented the StarTAC phone, very thin veiling of its inspiration. And suddenly they had the best-selling cell phone to that date, in 1996. Right? Audiences had an expectation of what was cool. It was set by science fiction. And as designers, we have to pay a great deal of attention to those expectations because we can deliberately thwart them or we can take advantage of them, but we can ignore them at our peril, right? The form of technology. The expectation is set in our audiences because they're sitting there watching cool stuff. We're also trained, our expectations are trained for the function of what things will do. We've seen robots in science fiction all the way back to Metropolis. Again, Fritz Lang had a character named Maria, the machine man, who stole the form of a real human. But I want to show you a clip from a little bit later, from The Day the Earth Stood Still in 1951. In this scene, a UFO has landed in Washington, D.C. in a baseball park, and a human has come out and is followed by a big robot. Is menacing because he has no expressions. That's the human on the ground there, Klaatu. Compare that with a robot from somewhat recent cinema, I, Robot, which is the destruction of the Asimov books in the 2004 film. But let's watch the very beginning of the film as the lead character sort of dismisses a robot that's in his life. And again, we're going to be paying attention to the function of that robot.
Good morning, sir. Yet another on-time delivery from...
Get the hell out of my face, Scanner.
Have a nice day.
Poor robot. Don't you feel sad for that robot? Right? Robots in science fiction are A, anthropomorphic, nearly all the time in the survey. And second, they are assistants for humans. They do menial labor. In the case of Gort, he's a cop. In the case of the FedEx robot, he's a delivery person. And that's no surprise. All of culture has tended to put menial labor down to either animal labor or machines whenever possible. But to see that repeated out in the real world is often quite a surprise. When we take a look at Honda's robotics development, Osimo, yes, is anthropomorphic, but what do they choose to have it do to show off its capabilities? They have it deliver coffee. $4 billion of research, and it's literally carrying Starbucks. Right? This notion that robots are going to be the servants that you have seen in sci-fi is very powerful. And in fact, both its form and its function are implied in that expectation setting. All right, so that's one way that science fiction sort of influences the real world by saying what you and I think is going to be cool, how it's going to function, and even how it's going to work. The second way is a social context, simply reminding us that we're humans using technology, and humans have certain capabilities and expectations that evolution is not going to rid us of anytime soon. This little clip from the Wim Wenders film. The Wim Wenders film is the first clip. Until the End of the World, and no, it's not Wim Wenders. Is it? Can anyone name? Who's my smarty? Until the End of the World, 1991? I think it's Wim Wenders. But in this clip, what we're going to be doing is we're going to see a character who is searching using a Soviet interface.
I'm searching. I'm searching.
That's the search engine.
Give me a minute.
And that bear walks around announcing that he's searching. He's searching until he finds the Trans-Siberian Express information that she was looking for. It's really ironic to be playing that at Google. The second clip we're going to be taking a look at is from The Matrix. Again, it's a very anthropomorphized algorithm.
I know you're Neo. Be right with you.
So Neo has come to visit
Bingo.
a character in The Matrix called the Oracle.
Not quite what you were expecting, right?
Now, the Oracle is a...
Almost done.
Sorry, I'm going to let her talk.
Smell good, don't they?
Yeah.
I'd ask you to sit down, but you're not going to anyway. And don't worry about the vase.
What vase?
Bad face. Oh my God, such philosophy. So the Oracle is just a prediction engine, right? It's a hidden Markov model. It's an algorithm. But similar to the big, goofy bear in the prior interface, these anthropomorphic visions of an interface are very attractive to audiences because we work really well thinking about things not as algorithms, which we're bad at thinking about, but thinking about them in a zoomorphic way, like with the bear, and in an anthropomorphic way, like with the Oracle. We can relate better to them because we are evolved to deal with humans and animals in our lives, certainly a lot better than we have evolved to dealing with ones and zeros, right? That social context plays out in a whole lot of ways where scenes in movies just remind us that, you know what? We're people. People have foibles. And that's quite interesting as a user-centered design exercise, but the one I'm super excited about is the final category, which is actually where science fiction proposes new paradigms for us to consider. This breaks down into 4 subcategories. The first is things that we as designers sort of know already about the world, but it's nice to see it written up on screen. And this little clip is from a Pixar short called Lifted. And in it, I'm gonna let the whole clip play. In it, a young alien learns the ropes of abduction from a more senior alien. Pixar has some of the best interface humor in cinema. Right? Undifferentiated controls are terrible usability. Any designer having gone through the very first class will know this. And it's just lovely to see it written up on screen for us to say, yes, 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 I know that, and that's hilarious. But there are also some things that are only known in like laboratories. Undistributed knowledge. In this case, I want to show you a clip from Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece, A Space Odyssey, from 1968. In this, we have a scientist who is having a video call with he's in a satellite, and he's having a video call with his daughter back on Earth. And there's a bit of banter that goes on, but what I want you to do is I want you to pay attention to the daughter's hands as she's in the video call.
Are you coming to my party tomorrow?
I'm sorry, sweetheart, but I can't.
Why not?
Well, you know, Daddy's traveling. Very sorry about it, but I just can't.
Oh.
I'm going to send you a very nice present, though.
All right.
Anything special that you want?
Yes.
Well, What?
A telephone.
We got lots of telephones already.
She begins mashing on the keys during the course of the call. Now, we know what was actually happening. That was Stanley Kubrick's daughter. They were running very late in the shooting schedule, and he probably just didn't want to take another shot. She needed to go home and get to bed. But from an audience perspective, we have to look at that and think about, wow, what's happening here? Or more specifically, what's not happening here? The call is not being interrupted. Now, that's something that the editor made a choice on, and Kubrick made a choice on, but it's also the right way it should work. If we had a smart interface, it would recognize that the daughter is, 4 or 5 years old? And she has no business pressing buttons in the middle of a call and simply ignoring her input. Right? She's not looking at the phone. The things she's talking about have nothing to do with the phone. That's the way it should work. There's been a great deal of research around affective interfaces that seek to understand the emotional state of its users as one of the primary inputs for how it processes what it should be doing. And this film nailed it in 1968, but it's not well distributed yet. So that's another category. Things that we see read on film, they're like, some people know about that, but it's not commonplace. There are also lovely examples of extensions of ideas. And for this, I want to show you 2 clips from 2 different movies in the Star Wars universe. The first one I want to show you is The Empire Strikes Back, and the second one is from The Revenge of the Sith. I'm sorry. But in it, what we're going to do is we're going to compare 2 visions of holograms, one from the Empire and the other from the Jedi. And what I'm hoping you'll notice is that the relationship of the representations of the people who are talking. So first, let's look at The Empire Strikes Back and Darth Vader talking to the Emperor.
What is thy bidding, my master?
There is a great disturbance in the Force.
I have felt it.
We have a new enemy. The young rebel who destroyed the Death Star. I have no doubt this boy is the offspring of Anakin Skywalker.
How is that possible?
Search your feelings, Lord Vader. You will know it to be true.
So really interesting, right? Darth Vader is looking up at his superior, and that superior is presented really huge. Now compare how the Jedi represent each other.
By Chancellor Palpatine.
Every Jedi is represented as if they were alive and in person at that setting. It reinforces the notion in a very simple interface. At a glance, you can tell that, the Empire is incredibly hierarchical, right? Darth has to kneel before the giant head of the Emperor, and the Jedi are supposed to be egalitarian, right? As represented by the fact that they're all their real sizes in the volumetric projection. Now, that's a cool thing that the filmmakers wanted to do. They wanted to show you the difference in these 2 organizations, I guess you could say. And they did it simply with the scale of the interactors. We can do the same thing in our interfaces today. If you were in a video call, the lead speaker is usually the largest one represented, right? In a CEO earnings report, even if it's a video call, that CEO should be the largest one in the interface. They're extending an idea in science fiction and actually representing it long before we had video chats in reality. But they're extending an idea to make it big, writ large in science fiction. And that's a cool way to propose paradigms. And the last one is where they're actually science fiction is actually proposing brand new technologies and problems for us to consider. This last clip I'm going to show you is from an unsung film from 2008 called The Sleep Dealers. And we're going to be meeting, I believe his name is Nemo, but he is a worker working in a factory in Mexico, but he is controlling a construction robot in San Diego. So he's just gotten the job, and he's looking at the connection. he sticks all these wires in his body, and he puts on an oxygen mask that helps him not sleep. And he wears these contact lenses that let him see through the robot's eyes. And here he is in San Diego. Now, it's a very dark movie. It talks a lot about this sort of offshoring notion of getting cheap labor and how we're going to exploit that in the United States. But from an interface point of view, they're also pointing out a problem, which is that he has a body that is upright and bilateral, and he has 2 arms and 2 legs. But that robot, when the camera turns around and you see it, does not have legs. It has treads that sort of crawl along the beams, and just these little grabbers with only 4 claws instead of 5, right? With 4 here and opposable thumb. Sleep Dealers raises this novel problem that the things we may control using natural user interfaces don't match our own bodies. And how do we handle the exceptions where the robot may have something that we don't, or alternatively where we have something that the robot doesn't, and yet we want to use it in part of the control? That's a novel problem, and it's one that's being explored in science fiction long before we get to the problems in the real world, certainly from a consumer level. I don't know anybody who's actually controlling a robot with those kinds of interfaces at the moment. So those are the 3 macro ways that science fiction influences design in the real world. By setting audience expectations, reminding us that humans have a core set of capabilities and constraints that aren't going to change very much for the foreseeable future, and even in proposing new paradigms. That's fascinating. That's stuff we can use. So if those are the lines of influence between science fiction and design, so what? That's a big question I need to end with because it's fascinating. There are some fun stories, fun things to look at in video clips. But so what? And I want you to think about a couple of things. The first is that even though science fiction and design are clearly related in influencing each other, they're not the same thing. We sit in cinemas and see really cool technology illustrated in science fiction all the time, and we can get a bit led astray by it in thinking that that's a good thing just because it's cool. But they're different. Science fiction design serve different masters. Minority Report for a long time was the go-to cool technology. And I can't tell you how many times in my design career, CEOs had approached me and said, we want our thing to be the Minority Report of janitorial service. Whatever it was. Our clients were excited by what they saw in the screen, and so they thought that that would be a good model for the real world, and it's just not. By recognizing that design and science fiction are different things, you can take inspiration from the good things that design does, and you can avoid the horrible pitfalls of the things that science fiction does terribly. Right? By thinking about sci-fi with a critical mind, you can begin to understand what it does well, where its blind spots are, and then stop using it as a tool strictly for entertainment and start using it as a tool for thinking about possibilities in the future. Which is why, whenever I talk about the Sci-Fi Interfaces project, I like to tell my audience, stop watching sci-fi and start using it. Okay, that's the talk. After a bit of applause to impress my nieces, we're going to have a Q&A session. So please, during the applause, think about great questions that you can ask as we hand around the mic. Thank you.
This might be more on the pop culture side of things, but I'm interested to hear the kind of top 3 eye-rolly sci-fi movie besides Minority Report.
Okay. Yes, I have a presentation actually that I was doing every year after the book was published, but I let it languish, about the best and worst interfaces in science fiction for that year. Let's see. I know number 1. Let me put that down because I want to reveal that one last. No, I'll go ahead and talk about that one first. So the worst interface I can possibly think of in sci-fi comes from Logan's Run, a 1976 film. It the lead character is a Sandman. He's a cop who's meant to sort of monitor and make sure that anyone who isn't heading to their scheduled death at the age of 30 doesn't flee the city. So if you don't go to Carousel and get killed, he'll chase you down and kill you anyway. And it's nighttime, and Logan wants to add a little sex to his evening. So he goes to this remote control and then turns to an alcove in his living room. And actually, similar to what Joe Fredersen does in Metropolis, he begins to sort of tune in potential sex partners. And he tunes in one, and it's this dude wearing no shirt, and he's kind of standing really macho, and Logan shakes his head. Apparently not up for dudes that night. And then redials it again and gets Jessica, who's a lead character in the film. But this is just the worst male gaze interface that you could possibly imagine in science fiction. It bypasses all sorts of horrible things about how do these people have any control over the situation, right? If you imagine it from Jessica's point of view, she's just teleported from room to room, and hopefully somebody will pick her. It's just awful. And the notion that he's got to dial them in, and you even see sort of this like staticky thing while they're coming in. Like, what happens if he just leaves them there? Right? It's just the whole thing, I'm sure, started from some movie producer looking at a Penthouse magazine and going, you know, we can make this real. It's awful. And there's no excuse for it. And they're remaking Logan's Run, and I really hope they get it right. And on my blog, I designed it again. So hopefully they read, but we'll see. So that one's a really terrible interface. Wow. Oh, so from the Star Wars Holiday Special. Holy cow. If you're not familiar with this, the year after Star Wars was made, George Lucas was still trying to get funds and make the second movie, but he really wanted to keep the movie in people's minds so they would buy toys. So he wrote a very thin script and handed it off to some people who did variety shows in the 70s and said, just make the script. And it's the most wretched hour and a half of television. George has tried his very best to scrub it from the internet, and he has failed, thank goodness. I mean, you can look back and see this horrible thing. So there's this one interface. The story takes place, the frame story is Chewbacca's family. They have a Christmas that is called Life Day, and stormtroopers are coming in to ruin Life Day before Chewbacca can get there. Chewie's father is called Itchy. And Itchy gets a present from a buddy of his who's a human named Sean Dan. And it's essentially, my apologies for this because it's kind of crass and my nieces are in the room, but it's essentially softcore porn for a masturbation chair that sits in the living room. Okay, it's a wretched both in its sort of cultural impact, and it's a tape player that they had taped onto the armchair, and then like a hair dryer that they had lowered over his head in order to play it. Now, that said, it's an awful interface, both in sort of its wretchedness and its telling, and even in the design of the thing. But there are some brilliant interfaces within the Star Wars Holiday Special. They're just hard to find. I will think about a third, but those two were the first two that come to mind. Great question. And sorry you had to see that, girls. Are there any other questions?
Love the title of your presentation, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
It's fantastic. And speaking of Star Trek, so there's the essence of an iPad in Star Trek, right? Before it even came out, right? The pad and all that. And there's a lot of power in that pad and so forth. Now we're seeing things like Siri coming, right? So the voice talking to the computer and so forth. Neuralink, right? You know, you'll be able to have the interface basically in your brain. Where do you see the lines of imagination and reality? And like, this is a chicken or the egg type of a thing? Like, what's feeding what? It seems like in your presentation that they both feed on one another, but where's the influence? Like, how are we influencing it, or is it influencing us? And how can we as designers create effective interfaces or experiences that people can use and that are real, based on like where's the imagination, like where's it coming from?
So I'm gonna talk about a trope that will probably make any real AI scientists in the room roll their eyes. If you think about artificial intelligence, it's largely discussed in three categories: narrow, general, and super. And narrow is the AI that we have in the world today. It's very good at some key things, but it can't generalize that knowledge. You can't ask Roomba to help plan your Thanksgiving dinner. General AI is AI that's very human-like, and then super AI is the great-grandchild of general AI that's so smart, we don't even know what the world is going to be like with that in it. It's like having a functioning God that, is real and can affect our world. The advent of super AI has been called the singularity in a number of places. But as we approach something that looks like the singularity, that's where I see imagination stopping. I have only read some good books about what the world is like with super AI in it. Ian Banks wrote the Culture series, which is one example. But I see lots of thinking in Hollywood leading up to that point, but not daring to go past it. In fact, Her from, not Spike Jonze. It is Spike Jonze, thank you. Kind of cops out and says, oh, once the super AI gets here, it'll just not be interested in us and go away, which is not the danger that people are really worried about. That's probably the second best case scenario. So I think that imagination is kind of stopping there. There's this big wall, and we don't see Hollywood really thinking beyond that point. Up until then, it's extending ideas. The Marvel Cinematic Universe has some great ideas about how AI can integrate into our lives, both as a sidekick, like with Doctor Strange's cape, or as the real superhero that makes the human thinks they're the superhero, like with Iron Man's outfit. Lots of examples of even the last book I wrote about AI is called Agent of Tech, and Nick Fury has a car that acts agentively over the course of the movie. So they're doing some really great film thinking there. Third part of your question was who is leading whom, and it kind of depends. Cinema is about sound and light, and so things that are cinemagenic tend to get thought of in film long before they get thought of and experimented in film long before they're thought of in the real world. But when it comes to information science, like the advent of the internet, film had no idea that was coming. Television had no idea that was coming. There is a connection that you mentioned, like the pad interface in Star Trek. There was also another interface that was pre-staged in Star Trek. Oh, no, the pad was in Star Trek before it came out in the real world, but Jobs, through Pixar, seeded the iPad in The Incredibles 2 years before it launched. It was the vehicle by which Mr. Incredible was invited to the island to kill the droid, or fight the droid. So there are some deliberate connections there. The last part of your question is about what can we as designers do? And I have two adjuncts. The first is study science fiction. Because what you need to do is separate that notion from what is cool from what is good. And as audience members, we tend to conflate them. We think the Minority Report interface is great, not forgetting that keeping your hands above your heart for any length of time is exhausting, right? We like to think that, oh, I totally want Iron Man's heads-up display in my life, not acknowledging that it is literally an impossible object from several perspectives, right? What's the display technology is the biggest one. And the thing that we see on film simply couldn't exist. So getting literate about science fiction, getting critical about science fiction, and then using that science fiction. On my blog, I keep all the interfaces tagged. So when I encounter sort of a new scenario, I like to think that I can go to this database and say, well, what has happened with wall-based computing across science fiction? And it can take me all the way back to Barbarella, where I can see Alfie and how that was represented all the way up to modern wall computers, or the Buck Rogers interface that we saw. So that's one tool that you can use. But I think the thing is just being aware of what science fiction has done, because you know your audience may have it in their head. Science fiction is the second most popular genre after action worldwide. So to ignore that genre is to ignore a lot of the experiences that your audiences have. That may not be a satisfying answer, but I'll think of some more.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much for that. I think my question piggybacks a little bit on that. We see a lot of screen-based interfaces throughout sci-fi, and then increasingly we feel like a screen-based sort of culture, the way we consume media. Do you think that our devices and our reality is so because as designers we are influenced by all these movies, which then conveniently convey screens because, like you said, it's sound and light.
Right.
Or that technology is just more accessible than more complex conversational interfaces or something like this.
So you're asking for my predictions. Sure. Yeah. All right. I have stayed deliberately neutral on that, but I have some answers. Since science fiction extends the paradigm that reality has established, what I believe we can count on in the future is that as audiences and users become more familiar with any piece of technology, filmmakers no longer have to explain it. It's a pattern that I call what you know plus one. And as people get more experience with Alexa and Google Assistant and forget the Microsoft one, sorry for any Microsoft people in the room. Cortana, thank you. That was kind of a voice interface moment. I liked it. Right, like science fiction will no longer have to explain that, oh, they're talking, but it is a robot, even though it sounds pretty human. So I expect in the future, as far as the presence of screens are concerned, that they will continue to be there because screens are really useful for showing graphic information or video. Volumetric projection has been, or holograms, have been with us since Forbidden Planet in 1951. And that's another convenient way to show it. But the filmmakers have to show some sort of trick to let the users, the viewers know that, oh, this is a projection and not a real person standing there. As those technologies become more familiar, we will see extensions of them in sci-fi. I think that we see screens a lot in science fiction because we have lots of screens in the real world. And I don't think screens are necessarily going to be going away because they can show graphic information clearly in ways that like smart objects can't. I have a pretty big critique on the blog about Doctor Strange's cape, in that it is cool, it's a great sidekick, but it has no communication, or it has very, very crude communication capabilities, and it needs to be a real effective teammate. It has to communicate in some way. It could be voice. That would kind of break the notion of it's being a cape. But to show visual information about where should I go, sure, it could tug him. That's hard to show in sci-fi. But if it could show him, that would even be better. Think back to the X-Men, the big pin board that they showed the map on. How would you do that without something like a screen? Pins are kind of like that, but they're just another screen, right? They're a 3D model. So no, I don't think that the fact of screens has a causality in their cinemagenics. I think they're genuinely useful displays of 2D information. They're crap when it comes to 3D information, but we don't have any replacement yet, unless you can afford to make a Xenotran Mark IV.
So one of my favorite speculative creators is Terry Gilliam. Yeah. And I think it was in The Zero Theorem where there's a scene where the main character has an advertisement pop up in his home and he tries to walk away from it and it follows him because every single surface is a screen basically. And I remember seeing that and just it blew my mind. I had like an emotional, visceral reaction to the idea of an advertisement following me down the street. And I was wondering, are there any interfaces you've seen within sci-fi that had a similar like visceral reaction where you were just like, oh, wow, I haven't thought of that, or I haven't thought of what that would, I couldn't, imagine life with something like that.
I couldn't imagine? Well, have you seen Black Mirror?
Okay, yeah.
Right? Like the whole premise of it's a beautiful, speaking of beautiful titles, Black Mirror is a beautiful title because it's describing the computer when it's off, or television screens when they're off, and we look at them, but we look at our own reflection. Oh, it's beautiful. But that show is rife with interfaces that are pushed into dystopia. I think there's only like 3 out of the series so far that even depict technology in a positive light or have positive results. So that one is rife with it. There are a few others, and I want to think of some examples that would get me right back to trying to answer Rebecca's third example of an eye roll, but yours is a little different, like dystopian tech. Brazil, another Gillian film, is also rife with sort of dark visions of technologies that are super small and sort of made large and invasive. There's a camera in Brazil that sort of pokes at, it's a security camera at the front of an office, and it sort of pokes and gets in the face the lead character as he's trying to sort of get into I think it's a bank, some kind of office park. And it's literally like it's like a bully coming kind of up to you and getting in your face. And for technology, robotic technology, to mimic bullies is really horrible for a nerd like me.
Yeah, so kind of going back earlier to what the neural interfaces kind of thing, that seems like kind of the holy grail of interfaces where you can just think something and it'll just happen or whatever. And will that be the end of sci-fi film because there's nothing to show? Like,
no, because sci-fi won't go there. There have only been a few examples of neural interfaces. There's a chapter on brain-related interfaces in the book. That's one of the ones I wrote. And there are a couple of them. There's a neurally flown ship in Star Trek. There are lots of sort of like downloading information interfaces. But the good news is, as far as cinematography is concerned, is that even neural interfaces are having some effect in the world. If it's participating in some sort of virtual space, you can show the virtual space, like Ready Player One, insert eye roll. Or if it's like a robotics thing, like you're controlling a ship, well, you can show the ship. The challenge for cinematography is to show the causality. And oftentimes they do that with pain. This is really hard. Or blinking lights if it's a brain interface. So no, I don't think it's an impossible problem for science fiction, but I don't think that they like showing that, right? Actors don't like acting with a neural interface because you're just sitting there, right? I think it is not cinemagenic, so it becomes a blind spot for sci-fi. I don't even know if it's ideal for humans, partly because with our bodies and the way we communicate with machines now, we can distinguish between I am talking to the computer and I am not talking to the computer, right? If my fingers are on the keyboard or I am looking at it, it might be able to infer that I'm talking at it, but I can turn and sneeze without deleting a file. With a neural interface, if it's always on, we would have to learn some kind of new language to be able to say, yes, I intend this now, or, oh my God, I'm fantasizing, please don't broadcast that, right? So I don't think it's ideal for humans. And fortunately, I don't expect cinema to try and lead that way because actors won't enjoy it.
I want to add on that.
Oh.
It was like Harry Potter.
Harry Potter?
Harry Potter is a neural interface, right? It's kind of like...
No, he's got a wand. When the wand goes away, he can't cast his spells. It's interesting to think about. There are lots of magic objects within the Harry Potter universe. But boy, howdy, let's grab a beer sometimes and talk about genre. Because is Harry Potter science fiction is a big question. But in short order, I would say yes. But no, I have not considered it sort of very deeply. But the fact that he's got to have a wand means that it's not entirely neural. Yes, sir.
So what are the interesting technologies or interfaces you've seen that you think they should be out, today, or if they're invented now, there are going to be disruptive technologies or interfaces? So
tech in sci-fi that isn't real, that I would love to see in the world. In Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, there is something called the perspective gun. Does anyone remember this? The wielder can shoot anyone, and that other person sees things from the shooter's perspective. And it's so brilliant because the sort of two competing male characters in the scene are sort of washing the to use a sci-fi reference, washing the floor with testosterone, and she shoots each of them, and they're like, holy crap, I'm being a jerk. So I would love the total perspective gun to be live in the world. I'm also super fascinated. I was talking before the talk with you and a couple other folks about futurism, but about the effects that teleportation would wreak upon the world. It would change notions of cities and of urban design and suburban design and the notion of real estate prices. Like, why would any of us live in the Bay Area if we could teleport here for work? And like live in Norway, I'd do it. So yeah, I think teleportation interests me as a world-building challenge, or to try and think about how the world would change with it. But it's so much less likely. I guess the same thing with the total perspective gun. But yeah, I would love to live in a world with those two things in it.
So I was wondering what you thought about kind of the idea of embracing new interfaces and how that'll kind of show up in sci-fi, possibly as comedy as we go forward. Because I'm just kind of thinking of, I have family members who use Google Maps and will pull up Google Maps and will pull up the route to where they're going, but won't turn on the voice. And so they'll just be driving, looking back and forth to the phone, because they still kind of like the agency of being able to direct themselves with the map, but not use the voice. And kind of if you go through your actual paradigm, there's probably periods for each of those where there was a like process to embrace whatever new technologies were coming up. And as people kind of say, we approach a singularity, there won't be as much sci-fi potential, but there could be a lot of potential in the embrace of these things or in people trying to mold them into their lives. So I'll just think of maybe that kind of opens the door for comedy and sci-fi going forward as opposed to more of a wow factor.
Let me restate what I think you said, which is that one possibility for science fiction is to show the comedy of people not using technology to its potential, or according to sort of like their old paradigms. So making fun of old people?
Or just making fun of people who don't trust it.
Don't trust it, right? No, there probably is a great deal of comedic potential there. One of my favorite science fiction films of all time is a very mean film, a very mean comedy called Idiocracy. And it's both brilliant, and there's a scene in it that was the genesis for my last book. So once you get past that meanness, yeah, I could see that might be a possibility. Comedy is really hard to critique, partially because there are comedies that will willingly break the fourth wall in a way that's very difficult to tease it apart from a critic's point of view. Mel Brooks, Spaceballs. It's really hard to tell when the joke is between him and the audience or between characters in the film. A movie like Idiocracy, all of the comedy comes from the diegesis. It's never the filmmaker joking with you. It's always a comedy from the situation inside the film. So I have neglected to review comedy over the course of this, 12-year project for that reason, for the most part. But I am just about to start the review of Idiocracy because the election's coming up. So I may have something to say in about a month. If you have questions after this one, I do pay attention to Twitter quite a bit. So you can tag me at Sci-Fi Interfaces or at Chris Nossel for thoughts that you have if you're feeling introverted or overwhelmed. Yes?
So how do you personally view sci-fi films that kind of are, I guess, in the future of at least when the film was made, but they kind of depict once that time has actually occurred, kind of false parallel universes that don't exist? For example, a modern day movie that's set today that has lots of CRT screens.
Are you thinking of like Maniac?
I haven't seen that one.
Okay.
I think Alien had lots of CRT screens on the spaceship.
Yeah.
Like to me, that doesn't really date well. And so it's kind of like a quirky, like, I don't know if would you blame the like designers of that to like, they weren't forward thinking enough, or like you kind of just like let them give them a pass? How do you kind of view those kind of weird realities?
So I have an art history minor, and I went to undergraduate in a time where the the virtue in art history critique was to view the art as complete in and of itself, and not second guess the intentions, the capabilities, or the paradigms of the maker. So when you take a look at, say, Egyptian art on pyramids, you don't say they just didn't understand perspective. You say, no, they understood perspective, but they wanted to depict this for what reason? That's the critique. I think it was called the new criticism at the time. I take that because I don't want to get spun. I want to learn lessons for design. I don't want to get spun out over second guessing what the maker's intent was. There's a great blog called Typeset in the Future that does a lot of that kind of thinking and sort of research into the way that films were made that Dave Addy does, that I highly recommend if you're interested in that sort of critique. From my perspective, I'm just not interested in that. I certainly think that there are some properties that can take that comically, so Terry Gilliam is one, but the new Netflix series Maniac is another, which is kind of alternate because there's a lot of like 70s sort of technology, but it's very clearly modern because there are little robots running around cleaning up poop, dog poop specifically, and it's a delightful art direction. And I would never want to turn away from that and say you can't learn anything from it, partially because when you're doing world building, you have to take economics into account. So in Alien, Weyland-Yutani is this horrible corporation that is trying to maximize profit at clearly the expense of any human life that gets in the way. So the notion that they would find the cheapest possible technology to outfit a mining ship is completely within that diegesis. I don't hold them to blame at all for that. I think it's actually very informative for what's happening in the film. But no, they're hard to critique when art directors make those choices, rather than sort of like the MCU that is trying to be earnest about its depictions of the future, in the same way that comedy is. But I will still give them that at the beginning and not categorically deny that that is something worth considering. I gotta say, as an audience member, you've been great and asked a lot of questions about my opinion, which kind of makes me uncomfortable, even though I'm at the front of the screen. I like to think of myself as an academician who has done serious studies. And I can tell you, but I'm very flattered that you're interested in my opinion, and I hope you've learned a little bit tonight and that I have sparked an interest in looking at science fiction technology critically. Thank you all, and I'll be around for a little bit afterwards.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming, and hopefully you'll join us next month for Design is Equitable, which we'll be having not on Halloween, but the week before.